Well, welcome to the SEEP Network's digital workshop with All Saints Atlanta. We are so pleased to have All Saints joining us today to discuss the work that the congregation is undertaking in looking into their past and how that impacts the present and where it will take them in the future, especially around the issues of racial equity and racial reconciliation. It's terrific to welcome this group with us, and I'm going to turn it over to Simon, the rector at All Saints Atlanta, and also add that we are so pleased that we will next year, February 23rd through 26th, be at All Saints for our in-person annual conference, our first in-person conference after COVID, knock on wood, fingers crossed. But we are thrilled to have this group from the parish with us today, and we look forward to gathering with them next February in person. So Simon, off to you.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, and we are so looking forward to welcoming folks to a beautiful Atlanta in February. It's a real privilege for us to have this opportunity to be in conversation with one another and with all of you watching in the wider church family. I'd love to begin with some introductions. Natasha, I wonder if we could start with you and you could share a little bit about who you are.
Great, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Joe. I'm excited to join this conversation today. I'm currently serving at All Saints as the Minister for Public Life and working closely with some of the others on the panel today about how do we express our faith through the work that we do in community, both within the church and outside of the church. So very excited to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Natasha. And maybe I just invite you to share a little bit about your I call it your day job. But
sure.
We see many of you in the day too, but just a little bit about that.
Yeah, I just didn't want to take up too much time. So I am also currently the first Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer in Habitat. I guess I can now say I'm technically a recovering lawyer. So I've been in the legal capacity at Habitat for over 9.5 years and recently in this role for the last 6 months. And have over time constantly tag teamed my ministry work and my vocational life and connecting the dots as such between Sunday and Monday and Sunday and Tuesday and Sunday and every other day of the week as I attempt personally and also through the work that I do to help connect faith and action. Not very revolutionary, it shouldn't be in our context, but not always so easily done. And so how do we do so with strategic intent as well as impact in mind?
That's great. Thanks, Natasha. Sarah, would you share next and offer an introduction?
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Hill, and I have been at All Saints for a very long time. And while there, I have done a variety of things, all of which have been marvelous for me. But nothing has given me more energy and spiritual charge than what I'm doing right now, which is some of what we will talk about today.
Thank you, Sarah. And Linda, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. I'm Linda Herrig. I am a member of All Saints. I'm currently on the vestry, and I chair our Faith and Public Life Committee. And I'm serving with Sarah. Sarah's being far too modest, and maybe she'll talk about this later. She's the chair of our MICA project, and I serve on that steering committee with her. And I'm also working with our adult formation planning group. In my day job, I'm a mechanical engineer. I work for a mechanical engineering firm, so I have both halves of my brain working most of the time. So at least certain days of the week. Anyway, very glad to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Linda. And I have the privilege of not just ministering alongside these three women and many others as rector, but growing in relationship with one another and trusting one another, and for myself as the leader of the community in continuing to explore, discover, stumble over the things that I don't know, the things that I can't see, what I don't understand, which is it's pretty vast terrain when you start to get into it, the things that I don't know, or the things that we don't know. And it's in that spirit of really humility that we want to offer our time up to you if you're watching this, that we don't assume any greater expertise than anyone else watching this webinar today. We know that some of you will be much further and deeper into the work of racial equity and healing. And there may be others who are just beginning that work. And so we are here as one of your peer churches, and it's a real privilege and honor for us to be invited to share our story. I think there are a couple of things that make our context particularly interesting, and this may resonate for you if you are also in a part of the country where people still like church. And here in the South, in Atlanta, people are still drawn to and energized by and invested in the church as part of our social fabric. And that's certainly true of All Saints. It's a place where people love to be on a journey of their own transformation by and large. And we have a lot of love for one another, which I think has helped us to further in this work together and stay together as one community. And I think the other thing about our story is our context really matters. Questions of racial equity and healing are not theoretical here, they're lived. People of all sorts are carrying the legacies, from slavery to Jim Crow to today, carrying those legacies in their bodies. And Atlanta's still that city which is working out its salvation. It's still persevering in how to be a multiracial city. And so we are smack dab in the middle of things in Midtown. If you come to the SEEP conference, you'll see quite how much we're in the middle of part of urban America's renaissance, and with all of the kind of intersections of society, we're right there at a crossroads. And so we feel that our focus in our own work, and I hope you'll hear some of that as we have this conversation together, is the work of racial equity and healing. And that we believe that one needs the other in order to occur. And so we hold both of those in their creative tension. And so noting that, we'd love to tell our story in the hope that it will illuminate something about your story, and tell it in the order, more or less. We'll see how we manage, but we might at least begin in the order of how things unfolded. We'd like to be honest and name some of our limitations and say where we get stuck, and say where people say, I don't want any more of this conversation. And others say, we've got to have more of this conversation. And then the whole group of people in the middle of that. And we would love to hear questions as we go. So with that, I wonder if we would, it feels inevitable, at least where we are. You always start this conversation in a way, it's either 400 years ago or it's the 1960s. So we'll start with the 1960s. There's plenty to say about 400 years ago, but Sarah, I wonder if I could begin with you. Something about our story of race and the civil rights era. That's where, to a degree, our story begins with our work with racial equity and healing. And at some point, I'd love us to explore something that you said several weeks ago that stuck with me, is that we keep getting stuck in the 1960s. We're sort of somehow keep on returning to that place in time. But maybe you could just share a little bit about the story that came before that we are building upon. Sarah, just to unmute there.
Thank you. I didn't say my day job is I'm a historian, and so I love being invited to start with the history of this particular movement. A big part to me of the All Saints DNA is our work in the civil rights movement in Atlanta. And we often at All Saints, we're very proud of this particular legacy. We often point to the rectors of that period, one of whom marched in the civil rights marches and also signed something called the Minister's Manifesto, which is pretty well known in Atlanta, but may not be at all well known outside of the city. This was a manifesto signed by 80-something Christian pastors, amazingly pleading with the city to obey the law. That was what the manifesto was. So, you know, at the time it was extremely courageous. Looking back, it's, you know, well, duh. But we've been very, very proud of that legacy. And one of the things I'm aware of is that when those ministers who were very courageous, I do not underestimate that, when they signed that manifesto, they made it clear that they were speaking just for themselves. They were not speaking for their churches or their parishes. And that to me is so telling and one of the great thorns in my spiritual side, I would say, because wouldn't it be a wonderful story for our future if people would say the whole parish was behind this. This was something that engaged everybody. So that's an important thing to me these days. But another part, and I think this is what you were alluding to, Simon, is that we are so proud of that history that we haven't all moved beyond that. Because in a sense, I think people might feel we did that. You know, we were there, we counted, and therefore it's done. And that is a great loss to us as a Christian community, I think. So that, you know, I could go on at some length about that, but I think that's where we need to move forward and know that there is a new calling. And the laws have been changed, but the hearts and minds, not so much so. And so I think that's an important part of our work.
It strikes me, Sarah, that we've sometimes talked about they're not missing decades, but in terms of a focused conversation and focused work on racial equity and healing, I think it's fair to say that our focus, just as one parish, was elsewhere, as was the case for the Episcopal Church at large. And I wonder whether there was an era where All Saints was very much involved with ministry to folks who were suffering with and ultimately died of HIV/AIDS.
Sure.
But do you feel there's an element to which that work prepared something of our hearts, or prepared to sort of shape the church or form the church to be in some ways ready in a way for the parish to engage in the way that it wasn't perhaps previous to that in the 60s?
I would say I hope so, because that's also part of our DNA, our work under a very inspiring and marvelous rector, Harry Pritchett. All Saints opened the doors to the AIDS community, to the gay community, because people were dying all around us and nobody was talking about it in the church. And Harry just opened his arms and opened the church. And of course, you know, looking back on this kind of thing, it seems like somebody was brave, somebody took a step and everything fell into place. It is, of course, never like that. And there were people who were very distressed to have AIDS talked about out loud. You know, they wanted to be sympathetic, but they didn't want any word about it from the pulpit, for example. It was unseemly. So I think that All Saints grew tremendously in that period as a parish, not just as the rector taking an important step. And I think that that is a soundboard for us today in the work that we're trying to do. We also, with the next rector, took another big step with marriage equity. And we have a very high population of gay married people with us, gay parents with us. And I think they are all wholly embraced by this parish. I think, you know, people have made a big step there. So in a way, when you ask the question, Simon, it makes me think that we have been growing toward this moment for a long time. And we can still act even though we're just growing, we haven't grown up, but we're still able to act.
And I wanted to begin there because I'm wondering, as people listen to this, part of our work of wanting to kind of trace the steps of our journey as a church through time helps us see and gives us that longer term perspective that we've been heading on this road. This is a natural next step for us, particularly at those times when tensions can be high and feelings can be high, or the news cycle can be very charged. And it helps us say, well, apart from the fact that we've been on this journey as a church for a couple of millennia, this always following the steps of Jesus locally in our local history. I wonder if I can bring you in, Natasha. I suspect it's not the first time, and maybe you just say a word about your previous, if I can call a church gig a gig, your previous gig was at what is sometimes called America's Freedom Church, that have heard that narrative from we're predominantly white congregation, yearning and wishing to become more and more multiracial, and the fact remains we're still a predominantly white congregation. I suspect it's not the first time you've heard essentially sort of post-racial. We kind of did that back in the past. We're in this sort of post-racial space now, so why do we need to necessarily talk about it? All this to say, I suspect that's coming to All Saints. It wasn't the first time that you have encountered that narrative.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, well, there are a few similarities and then some very stark differences, I think, between the work that I've done prior to All Saints, primarily in terms of my church ministry service, primarily in an all Black context. Doesn't mean everyone had the same political perspective and persuasion, but yet racially pretty monolithic. So much so that when Simon asked me to consider coming to All Saints, I said to him, you do realize that I'm Black and I'm not Episcopalian. And of course, All Saints has had other Black clergy, but I just, there was a lot in that question other than the humor, tongue-in-cheek component, which was, okay, we're trying to do something different. Okay, let's see what this looks like. Because I was actually, as I asked Simon that, I'm saying it to myself, like, oh, this will be fascinating. I've not served in this context. I've been doing racial equity work in mixed company for about 25 years, but had not served in a ministerial context in that way. So having been at Ebenezer for 11 years prior to serving at All Saints, very historical church like All Saints, clearly very involved in the civil rights movement from top to bottom. But still a lot of, that was a wonderful and profound historical moment for our church and for our leadership and for our congregation, but we can't get stuck there. Like Sarah's saying, how do we remain relevant today? And so many of you know about some of the work that Ebenezer has been doing and is doing, and that's the same, but a very similar challenge, right? At the same time that we have this historical imperative to continue this work at All Saints, it also, it gives us courage, it gives us hope, but it also should push us, right? And that is the hope, that we don't get stuck in the wonderful stories, but it should compel us forward to say, okay, in the next 50 years, and Linda and Simon and Sarah have heard me ask this, in 50 years from now, what is the story we will tell about All Saints? In the year 2020 and 2021, this parish in the middle of Atlanta's city did was on the breaking forefront, on the frontier of how do we begin to do this work. So it's a wonderful charge, and I'm grateful to be a part of that charge. The other side of it, and I've been pretty explicit about this coming in. I walk around the world as a Black woman, but I come from a mother who is white German descent out of Minnesota, and a father who is African American out of the rural areas of Georgia. And so my entry into the conversation of racial justice is a very personal context to it, and one which continues to give me courage in moving forward and speaking quite a bit of truth even in this context. So one of the moments of truth that I have oftentimes in conversation at All Saints is, let's be explicit about what we do offer. So at All Saints, we have this amazing history. We also have a very well-resourced congregation. What does that then translate into? So one way that I kind of categorize it is, this is an opportunity for All Saints to also tithe their privilege. not just the white privilege component, but the well-resourced component, the well-connected component. That goes a long way when you connect it to your faith by saying tithing it. What are we doing outside of what we should do? What does that offering tithe look like? How are we stretching beyond our comfort? How are we stretching, right, to be sacrificial in the way in which we live out our faith? And then the other thing that I find interesting, and I haven't talked about this as much, but I told a few people that the other whisper that I heard in coming to All Saints and experiencing an Episcopalian expression of our faith is flipping the conversation about where the mission field lies. And I think in many instances, and I'm sure some of you may have already thought of it this way, but I think of All Saints as a mission field. You know, this is also an opportunity to talk about how we express our faith, as Sarah has said, not just in head, because we know that that is a very prevalent way in which, in the Episcopal context, we express our faith, but also with heart. And what happens in that translation and that connection point? And how is that then expressed in dealing with issues of racial equity? And the way in which we challenge our pre-written scripts about racial equity in the church, the ways in which we challenge our theological understandings of that. That to me is the soul excavating work that I've been charged to participate in at All Saints.
And I love that as a great lead in, that one of the parts of our story is how a lay-led grassroots movement that says, what about us doing some heart work? What about us getting into the interior of our lives so that we might go on that long journey of change and transformation and formation, so that we are equipped, so that we can become the people that God calls us to be, to do the work for a transformed, to seeking out a transformed world. And that part of that conversation, it may not be the genesis, but part of that beginning was Linda, you heading to Sarah's house, which is often at All Saints, I'm sure it's true of many congregations, the best things happen when parishioners say, you know what, we need to do more, we need to do something differently. And you had one of those, we need to do more conversations together. I wonder if you could speak about that, which led to the genesis of, we'll talk about the Micah project, but could you share that beginning, Linda?
Yes, thank you. So, we are so lucky in Atlanta because we have all this amazing support around us. Joe talked a little bit earlier about having Catherine Meeks and the Absalom Jones Center here. We have Ebenezer. So I feel like we're in this milieu of just amazing resources. And Catherine had been to our church and she had some events. She had Brian Stevenson speak at another church down the street, and she was leading pilgrimages to lynching sites, and we were learning about the Equal Justice Initiative. So we did a little bit of stuff at All Saints, but anyway, I just felt called to do more. So I looked around and Sarah just seemed like the logical person to go talk to. And she had been in the church much longer and knew a lot of this previous history. And I just wanted to know, is this a place where we can go all in on this work? And what will that look like? And who are our people and how can we do it? And so it wasn't anything planned. We were just sitting at her kitchen counter and just talking, and one thing led to another, and she eventually decided to start this group and called me and said, well, if I do it, will you be in? And of course I said yes, because we had these conversations. So a lot of it seems like it's just these informal conversations over a cup of tea. What can we do? Who else should we call? And it was very informal and like you said, very grassroots. And we were lucky enough to be able to plan some adult formation events. And Sarah, my tendency is to gather a small group you know, Sarah's tendency is to gather dozens. So she called what she called the Micah Steering Committee. I'll let you explain this, but there were 15 of us crammed around my dining room table, which is only big enough for 8. Sweating and potlucking and talking. And anyway, she's very good at calling a big group. Sarah, you should talk about the Micah project.
I want to, yeah, thank you, Linda, because I want to say I'm so proud of our steering committee. And this was 15 people that we did not all know one another. I did not know everybody, but we had it. To me, it looked like what I think of as the kingdom. We had black and white, gay and straight, married, single, partnered, not partnered, employed, not employed, male, female. The age range was from the late 20s to the late 80s. I mean, we had some input. And did we all agree on anything? Not on your life. Did we have a plan? No. What we had was hope and a longing for something to happen. And I want to give a shout out to the steering committee member who said we should call ourselves the Micah Committee. And somebody else, another wonderful person, said, no, we should be the Micah Project. And here is the thinking behind that. Of course, acknowledging our prophet Micah. But if you break apart the name Micah, M-I-C-A-H, stands for Mission is Conversation and Healing. And that's what we wanted to be about. So the other thing that I think is important about that name is what Micah called us to do: act justly, love, kindness, see, those are all action words. Those are not, let's sit in the pew and have somebody tell us what Jesus said 2,000 years ago about loving your neighbor. Let's love our neighbor. Let's actually do it. Let's seek justice. So it's been, the Micah Project it's been absolutely fabulous. I'm so proud of the steering committee and the work that this group has done. And Linda has been right there. So thank you, Linda. And let me say, our clergy that we didn't lean on too hard, totally supportive. Thank you, Simon. We appreciate your support so much.
I know there's a question that's come in that it's asking about, there's a vestry member, a mostly white church, 2 or 3 years on a reconciliation process, and are looking for that advice to move beyond research and discussion. And we've talked about that. There's no place Episcopalians would rather be than in their heads. And I think so. Part of our answer to that is it's that organic. We don't necessarily know. We don't all agree, but our hearts are in something here. And the story is that did grow. And the question that's been added to that is, how much buy-in have you had from the larger congregation, which is, and we'll get to this in a moment, that much of the work that's happened since George Floyd's killing, of course, have happened in the midst of a pandemic, where with most of the church at large, we're attempting to further this work distance from one another, doing it on a computer screen by and large. But I wonder if before we get to the COVID pandemic part of our story, the Micah Project went well beyond those 15 people crammed around the table. I wonder if you could speak to that question of how it started to take life and form in the congregation as a grassroots lay-led.
Sure.
I mean, the key role of the clergy was to say yes, get out of the way, support, and amplify, because that was already this wonderful growth happening.
Well, one thing, and Linda, we'll tag team on this. One thing we were very determined to do was to ground the Micah Project work in Scripture, and to make it clear, this is something I feel very strongly about. Race has been made into a partisan issue, racial issues, but for all of us, I think in the Micah Project, it is very much a spiritual issue. It's part of our need for healing, It's our need for healing. And that's something that Catherine Meeks has stressed to us as well. And so there are people on the steering committee who say, we're preaching to the choir. And I say, build it and they will come. I mean, you know, they're just two different ways to look at this. But what we have found is that through education, we have spent plenty of time on adult formation with some great classes. And the beauty of the Zoom world is that all kinds of people can come who wouldn't ordinarily come into a classroom. And so depending on the kind of class we have offered, you know, we've had the history of the Episcopal Church. That series was extremely well attended, I think, showing that the heart of the parish is very much Episcopalian and wanted to know that history. We have done environmental racism, we've done redlining, and we've done such a wide variety that I think it's left a space for lots of people to tune in. I think the evidence of our increasing success is when we spun off and did the conversation part we wanted so much to do from the beginning, and took advantage of the National Church's Sacred Ground curriculum. And now, through the amazing energy of one of the steering committee members, we have 9 concurrent Sacred Ground groups working. And I was attending one on Sunday, and a member said, this has been transformational for me. And that, of course, is what we want. I think all of us are seeking that. Linda, you want to?
Well, you know, one of the great things, and I didn't realize I was going to invoke Catherine Meeks so much, but she really has been a North Star for us, because, you know, what happens a lot of times is people go to hear Brian Stevenson speak, and afterwards, what can we do? What can we do? What can we do? We need to do something. And she was so great about saying, well, get together and watch a documentary, watch 13th, and show it 5 times this summer and have discussion groups after that. Or she would say, go to Montgomery and go to the Equal Justice Initiative, you know, and go to the memorial and go on pilgrimages, see what's happening in the community. So one of the things that happened was in 2019, this is how things have happened, you know, kind of like gradually and all of a sudden, like not out of any grand master plan. Sarah said, oh my gosh, it's 2019, August 2019. There was the 1619 project that everybody was reading about that summer. And that summer, Sarah said, we should do a service in August. And I think it was like June. And we all looked at her like she had grown 4 heads. There's no way. But everybody got on board. Simon got on, we picked a date. That date didn't work. The bishop wanted to come. We changed the date so the bishop could come. Our music minister got all into it and found this incredible. We put together this amazing service in almost 0 time. And it was hugely attended, hugely impactful. And again, that grounding in spiritual transformation and worship and prayer and, you know, kind of stumbling along. What is it we say about ourselves? Episcopalians are the people that just pray together. And that's what that service felt like to me.
And I want to draw, yeah, please, Natasha, I'm going to draw you in. Yeah.
But only if you're going to say more about Micah.
I was going to take us, but the Spirit's leading you, so you go, and then we'll see what happens.
So I'm trying my best not to come in and turn over tables in this moment. And it's occurring to me as we're speaking and thinking about the questions that were asked in the vestry. So I think the work that Sarah and Linda are doing and leading through the Micah Project and the groups of the Sacred Ground are very important. The work now that we're trying to pull and align together through Faith in Public Life and convening these various very justice forward groups, very important. They provide an on-ramp. But let me just offer, if I can. There are lives depending on this church taking this issue seriously. Like I'm raising 2 Black boys. And in this moment of pandemic, the 2 questions about vestry, we've talked about it. We pray on it. We provide wonderful onboarding. Everybody enters this journey differently. I just want to come and offer the fact that, you know, when my white friends come to me and ask me, what can I do to make a difference? I tell them, raise children that don't kill mine. That sounds very harsh, but it is true. And we know that our faith and our theology impacts the way people act and think. It impacts assumptions. And so if we're having study groups in the church as a whole, and we feel comfortable, we're not doing the work. If we are just convening spaces for people to comfortably come and talk about these issues in an intellectual, heady space, we are not doing the work. The fact that Sarah's saying someone came to her and said that this was transformational, that means this person had to shift some assumptions and some scripts. We need room for onboarding, yes. But as a church that is seriously committed to doing this work, we also have to create timelines where we say, you know what? We've got some onboarding folks. People are onboarding, but some people are ready now to move to the next level, and we've got to push them to do so and provide an opportunity to do that. And at a certain point, as the church evolves in this space, it's kind of like this train is moving forward. So those of you who asked the questions about the vestry members, not everybody's getting comfortable. Everyone doesn't have to be comfortable to move forward. And so it is very important that you keep that momentum and expectations going. So, you know, I'm hearing some of the folks on there like, well, we don't want to, you know, we don't want to lose those who feel like we're just too. There are lives depending upon us doing this work. And so
yeah,
we've got to figure out how we provide grace and provide space while at the same time saying, okay, we're going to onboard you, but at a certain point, right? Because the Christ we serve, the witness of that Christ deserves more than you feeling comfortable in a study group. And so we've got to figure out how we keep that stirring going while giving you space, you process, ask me questions you don't want to ask anybody else. You can touch my hair. I don't care. But you touch my hair and you keep moving with me to change the way that policing is done in our community. You know, let's ask these questions. I'll give you grace. You give me grace. You know, we're extending all that. But we can't keep just, you know, figuring out the next study group. And what I love about the work that All Saints is doing is that I think we're in the midst of moving people in that way. So we have some that are trepidatious, but like Linda, the term North Star, Sarah used the other day in a conversation about how do we find a way to remain uncomfortable, right? How do we, I like to say, do DEI yoga, diversity, equity, and inclusion yoga. And Sarah said, as long as we keep focus on our North Star. So a big part of this work is identifying that North Star and saying, you know what, come hell or high water, we're going to keep moving forward toward that North Star. Because there is a birthing before us that we have got to get to. There is a transformational movement before us that we have got to keep directing our people toward. And so I wanted to give that sense of urgency in this work. It is not just so you can say back in 2020 and 2021, I did a great Bible study at my church.
So I'm going to share something that you said this weekend where, you know, we were talking about the laws that have just been passed in Georgia in our legislative session that are all about voter suppression. And you were talking about the way that we have the power to convene and the CEOs that we didn't call and that we didn't, you know, engage in our congregation to go down to the legislature while those laws were being crafted, you know, was a missed opportunity. So don't just convene the NGOs and the groups that are charitable. Let's convene all the power brokers that are in our pews to go down there and say, no, we can't do this. Lives are at stake. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Natasha.
So I want to keep this going. So there you go. The Spirit has woken us up. Thank you, Natasha. But let's keep going, because to almost sort of offer a tactical answer to the questions. One of the questions here, and there's a lot, I'm going to try and pick them up. Essentially, how do we keep doing this work courageously when we're receiving pushbacks? People say this is too divisive. So there's a 3-letter little sign I have on my desk that is from your partner in crime, Linda, in your adult formation committee. And it says just enough dissonance. And so part of the tactic, I think, is to help us keep that creative tension. And part of your role at All Saints, Natasha, certainly of the last year, thinking about, for example, our Faith in the City series, is allowed us to have that creative tension as something as simple as this, is that a church that loves to learn, and noting that, but to ask the question, who are we learning from?
Right.
And stating, we know that there's a great deal that we're simply ignorant of. We can't chart a way forward. And part of the context for this learning is that we might say, how might we join the work of racial equity and healing in the city of Atlanta? But you and I have been enjoyed such rich conversations with thought leaders who've predominantly been from the Black community in Atlanta that we wouldn't have had before. And just very frankly, we wouldn't have had without your role. And so those of you who are listening to this as vestry members or rectors, without your role situated in the city as part of our staff, rather than situated in the church, we would have been missing all of those connections to know who to reach out to.
Well, so first, thank you for that. But I have to, and I know, Simon, you don't necessarily want this moment, but I'm gonna give it to you. So this is part of my discerning process when I came to All Saints, and so much of it really had to do with what I discerned from Simon as the leader of this flock. Very strong lay leaders, as you're hearing from Sarah and Linda, but the leader of the flock who says and trusts his people enough to follow their prodding. So Simon, in so many ways and in many conversations that he and I had before my coming, showed evidence of this, right? And he says, and one thing you said to me, Simon, and this is not in any way to elevate myself, but you said, my people find their home in your voice, many of my people. And the voice that I think you were hinging in on was the one that you all just heard. So Simon has a capacity to handle some of my very strong conversations, and he has very strong conversations as well. The truth piece is essential to this work, right? And not being afraid to have very honest conversations. But the other part too that I thought, Simon, is I feel like you and your leadership, the vestry, looked around the table and said, who's missing? And a lot of churches, and just looking at some of the questions, or you're realizing you're in a predominantly white congregation. So who's missing? You don't have to wait for people of color to join your church. What you do is you identify folks who may not ever join your church, but who are essential to providing information and perspective that you're missing. And to be able to look around a table and say who's missing is a very humble act, right? You think in one of the most well-resourced congregations in the Southeast, you're like, something's missing? How could it be missing? But Simon and leadership realized that was the case. And I'm not saying that was me. What it was that's what I think evolved into this Faith in the City conversation. Because what happens so often in very well-resourced congregations of all races is we think one of the best ways we can help people is help people through a charity perspective. Let's go help those poor people on this side of town and help them with housing, with food, right? And that's important because folks need help. But we also, when we do this real work, we need to be willing to have people at the table who are in parity with us. That's the equity part of this conversation. Diversity, key. Inclusion, important. But we need people who are in parity, who I don't talk down to, who I am not above. There's no power play because we're at the same level. That's what Faith in the City has done. We have resourced individuals who are just as brilliant, just as successful, just as influential, who happen to, not all of them have been Black, but who happen to be of another race, who are not members of All Saints, but who provide amazing intel, insight, best practices, lessons learned, and perspectives that challenge our assumptions. Right. And that to me, Yes,
those
one who's
lenses.
listened in. Yes, who
Yeah,
has a
those
lens.
lens. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so Simon, I really have to applaud you, because that is not easily done. And it's not something that I think all of us, are willing to do, especially in the leadership of a church that's very diverse politically, in a very politically divisive moment. And turning into an issue that, as Sarah pointed out, has been so partisanized, and being able to say it's not about partisanizing this issue of race or the issue of need with respect to housing or education. This is an issue we all must tend to. So I applaud you for that. And that's really what that faith in the city conversation has been, that we're now shifting a narrative by saying these folks are part of our understanding of brilliance. These folks who look different than us are part of our narrative of what success looks like in this space. And the security of a leader to bring me on and say to me, all the ways in which you're out in the public space doing work, you're not a traditional ordained clergy who only focuses on church. You keep doing all that stuff, because when you do that stuff and you do it with an eye toward the church, you can bring those resources. And that has set me free to be what I believe God has called me to be in this moment. And I'm so grateful for the grace that I have had in serving at All Saints for that reason.
And that model, and I thank you for all of that, Natasha, that model, what you've just named, is the most recent sort of iteration has been a seemingly unconnected, it would seem, to the work of racial equity and healing. It's something as sort of everyday as let's connecting the dots, connecting your life of faith to your life of work. But it's that very movement that says, just as that we can now say to the nearly 3,000 members of the church, your life, located, situated in your neighborhood, if you're, we've got a whole bunch of people under 18 in your school, in your workplace, whatever, in your family, that's the place where you can then get this out of your head, connect your head and heart, and actually put your feet on the ground. And as you said, be something and say something as if a life depended on it. And what you've raised up for us today is that because a life does depend on it. And so that makes it's this, if you're listening to this and whatever you're kind of translating to your own context, it's that long journey to move us beyond our history at All Saints, which was more, and understandable, it was the 1960s, more clergy centric. And I think if people ever ask me, well, what do you want to achieve? And I want to get a look back at some point and we could say, we did this. And what we did was maybe one hot, holy mess, but we did something together. And I wonder if we can extend the conversation, because one of the things that we, if you like, resisted, again, the creative tension, there's always that desire to resolve, get to resolution. And part of the desire for resolution was coming from people who were very much enthused by this work. And so particularly with the terrible events with the murder of George Floyd and all of the experience of what we've called the twin pandemics of this last year, there's been that pressure to sort of, let's do something, let's say something, let's be something. And we went about this task, and it sounds like a classic Episcopal fudge, that we formed a committee. Like, oh, great. But it was to say, we don't know the answer. We don't know what the best thing is for us to do. In fact, what we know what is best to do is not to rush to an answer. What's best for us to do is to say, we don't know. And particularly as the white leader of a predominantly white church, the best thing I can do is to say, I don't know the best way ahead. We felt that what we needed to do is to engage a multiracial, diverse group of people to learn from folks outside of the All Saints, forming this racial equity and healing steering committee, and ask the question, not how can we swoop in and solve, but how can we come alongside and join work that's already happening that will be the right fit, that where we could offer our best and our passions. And I'd love to have us talk about that. But part of the tactic is to say, some people will go on this journey here in their heads. Some people will feel it strongly in their hearts, and other people will need to do something. And their way of transformation will be, Brian Stevens says it will, when they can get proximate with a life that's different to their own, a shift will happen. And I think that was our story during the AIDS crisis, that proximity changed the parish. But I wonder if we could chat about that, because that's been part of our work, and there's been a need for us to be patient even with our own process and figuring out, maybe this won't take even the year, maybe it's going to take longer because we still haven't got our parish in the same room because of COVID. And so we want to be sure that we're doing all we can to see a change in people's hearts as best as we can. There wasn't a question there, that didn't really help anybody, but I'm just, what have you, Natasha and Sarah, you've been a part of that work. Where do you think we are in terms of the rest of the parish's sort of desire for us to now let's do something, let's engage the city?
Well, I'll jump in here to say a couple of things, Simon. I think that we have been urged many times by our friends of color to learn to listen. And so in that sense, I very much applaud what you've done. But I want to say that your Sunday series with Natasha and the steering committee for racial equity and healing, which meets about once a month, to hear from these remarkable speakers. What that has done for me as a parishioner has again given me hope, because I see the possible in what these speakers have said to us. Initially I might have thought housing, this is an insurmountable problem. My hat's off to Natasha for having spent all those years working on this. It's impossible. But then when she came with other housing people and spoke to the steering committee about housing solutions, I realized how we have not been listening to people who could really lead us into another place. I don't have any way of knowing how much of the parish has been engaged because of COVID. So, what I have found in my own work with the Micah Project is the face-to-face on Zoom has been, that's been pretty amazing. An intimacy opened up that way. But as far as a larger group, Natasha, you would be maybe better able to speak to that.
Yeah, so I would love to say that everyone loves everything I say at All Saints and all that I do. I know that is not the case. But what tends to happen is the favorable come to me, right? So I've heard quite a bit of really great feedback, which doesn't mean that there's not pushback and resistance. I just haven't heard it. And I think part of that, obviously, Sarah, 2 months into my service at All Saints, we went right into the pandemic. So just like you, it's somewhat hard to gauge. What I have enjoyed, though, is really seeing people work through and process what we're doing and think about it and engage it. And in the racial healing and equity conversation, I have worked very closely with some of the lay folks that are leading those efforts, and the questions that are asked, I love, because what we are now doing, which is what I try to do in my professional context, this conversation of equity and diversity and inclusion, it's not just a concept, right? We should focus on it as we focus on any other business strategy in the professional context, or as we do with any other transformational strategy within the church, and that we take it seriously. We ask the hard questions, we dive in, we find the resources, we push some of the components of it that won't have greater impact to the side and align and focus on those that do. Those are the kinds of conversations that we're in right now. So I love having that component. And what it has also done, as Sarah, you've just evidenced, and Linda, you've evidenced, is you all are highly accomplished in your fields. And now lending that expertise and thought to how we go after a spiritual concern is awesome, because now we're engaging loving the Lord our God with all of our minds, with all of our hearts, right? With all of our souls. And ultimately, the question, and Sarah and Linda and Simon know, I'm on a campaign to launch a neighboring movement throughout the country, because that's part of my response to the housing and the segregation that has been legislated at the federal, state, and local level. that has led to so much division because we've grown up only thinking or knowing neighbors who look just like us. So when God says, love your neighbors as yourselves, you're like, I can love all the white people because I grew up around them. They're neighbors. They're fine. That's Joey's son. He would never do anything wrong. But how about neighbors that look nothing like you, that are from another side of the tracks, that, you know, will you say that also when the police come looking and say, oh, that's Barbara's son. He would never do anything wrong. I know him, right? It's that conversation we've had in our own congregation about when do Black boys go from being cute to being threatening, you know, because we don't know them as Barbara's son or kid because they didn't grow up at the house on the street. So how do we launch this neighboring conversation and the call to neighboring as Christ has called us to, not once as a second commandment, but the third commandment, I always say on the eve of his death. And he says, scratch the loving your neighbor as yourself. He doesn't say that, but that's how I read it. But love your neighbor as I have loved you.
Yes.
That's a different level. As Christ has loved us. Oh my goodness. You mean I've got to lay down, you know, my comforts of life to love someone else in the way that Christ loved me, you know? And so how we go about that is the great work I think we are in the midst of.
So I want to, we're getting close to our time. I want to bring in the role of leadership and think particularly about vestry. There's a question here about a small congregation, and the largest proportion of the Episcopal Church are smaller congregations. And so this is a very relevant question. It's wanting to avoid, it's a question about avoiding tokenizing when, you know, a small congregation and the one or two members are people of color. But I wanted to offer an answer to that actually by thinking about the role of leadership, and just to be very open, that on one hand we have, and I think we almost sort of have a little bit of pride at All Saints about how part of our well-resourcedness is that we've got a deep bench to choose from for vestry service. And I think it's fair to say that we have struggled our way through work that we engaged in. We for one of the things we did for this, what, you know, we call our program year, was to engage with an outside entity that helped us to develop as lay leaders, and that happened for the staff. It's a staff of about 30, and then the vestry of 18, and the staff had a good experience, and the vestry had a real split experience, and the split was a classic split. Because, and part of it was some folks want to focus on the structural, the organizational, policies, procedures. And the organization we work with said, yeah, that's all good, but there are these other levels of change at the personal and the relational, the personal and interpersonal. And we keep on coming back to that, and that's the point of tension. Without that internal change as leaders and as a leadership body, then good governance is hindered. Maybe it's not even possible. And so part of my so our final thing, I wonder if we could talk about that. I know, Linda, you, of course, you're on the vestry, and Natasha, you've helped the vestry and sort of try to get a sense of where we're at. Part of my answer to the question of avoiding tokenizing is saying, make this everybody's business. And in the Episcopal Church, there's a really surefire way of making it everybody's business by persistently and consistently making it the vestry's business, because our polity, you know, places that at the center of the village, at least in theory. So I wonder if we could speak to that as a closing, because there's the sense in which, again, not wanting it to be a clergy-centric chapter that we're writing, but a chapter about us all. The vestry, the role of the lay leaders, is so key. What have you seen, Linda, in your experience as a vestry member, as we've tackled this over the past year?
Yeah, well, it has been rocky. And, you know, I have spent a lot of time wondering why it's been a rocky process. But for me, the way that this work becomes the work for everyone is to make sure that we remember that this work is spiritual formation work. It is just like prayer. It is just like worship. This is not some people who got awakened are going to go fix a problem. This is, you know, your feeling, Natasha, that got us all right up at our computer saying, my sons are in danger. I feel that way about my spiritual life. And so that to me is the turn where this is our baptismal covenant. I will seek and serve Christ in all persons. There's just this, and so, I get it that people, some people are the action people and some people are the talking people and the personal work people. And it is driving the men on our vestry absolutely bonkers. Can I just say it that way? Sorry, they're going to watch this video. But it does seem to be the split where the women are kind of all on board and the men are but where's the action piece? This is not the way we do DEI training at my office, So anyway, I'm sort of rambling, but in response to what you're saying, it is a struggle. And we just have to keep coming back. If I can bring in Isabel Wilkerson and her work about caste, she has this metaphor of the house. We all live in this kind of old, rambling, shambling, rundown house, and we have to deal with the infrastructure. That to me is like the piece of spiritual formation work, that it's not ever done. You don't ever say, oh, I replaced the heater. Nothing's ever going to happen to our house again. I'm never going to need to fix anything. So anyway, it just feels like it's an ongoing work. And to wrap up, I was thinking about my father. And the decades that it took him to transform his heart around marriage equality, and to watch his journey. And it was personal, it was my sister and her wife. And but over those 20 years, he really, his heart and his life transformed. It just seems like it's a long journey. It's a lot of work. It doesn't sound like it's going to be fast, right, Natasha?
Right. And I think they're fits and starts, right? So let's do some of the fits that help us and some starts that help continue moving along, but we may go like this. We may not go like this. We may, it's the same. We during Lent, we're fasting and, maybe for a day, maybe for 2, maybe for 3, and then we have that cheeseburger and then the next day we get back on. But we're still moving forward in that direction, which I think is important. And I think as a leader, and so 2 things, Simon, I think as a leader, part of the job of being a leader is managing the discomfort and encouraging people in your discomfort. You'll be fine. Just keep moving. And I think it's also making sure we realize we all own this conversation. This conversation on race is not my conversation. This conversation on equity is not my conversation as a woman. This conversation, right? This is our conversation. So I love the house analogy. And I often use an analogy of we were all given this bag of goods. We all have the same pantry full of yucky food we never eat. We keep pushing to the back. But we've got to find a way to make a really tasty meal out of some old anchovies and some raspberry mustard and pretzels, right? Like that's basically what we've been given. This bag of goods from generation to generation that we've got to figure out how to create a feast and invite all to the table. And maybe someone you bring in from the outside, Simon, brings a roasted turkey that helps it or something. But it's that kind of, when we think about truly communing, we go through our holy sacrament and we talk about breaking bread and shedding blood. Where is the breaking within, right? Where is the shedding of our own layers of comfort so that we can ultimately have true communion?
That's a beautiful image. And I hold that image as our closing, because if you've listened to this and thinking, well, there's all these different pieces, the fundamental thing I hope you may have picked up is that the other thing we've had is each other. Mm-hmm. And, the 4 of us have had each other just to have this conversation. but we've kept to that principle that we're beings in communion. And so if you're listening to this thinking, how might this play out in our setting, is that what you've got is at least 2 or 3 who are gathered in Christ's name, and that's it. You got each other. And it's a great lesson for us, you know, in this large downtown church. At the end of the day, all we needed is each other to put our feet on the ground and move forward. So as always, we could go for another hour, but people would stop listening. So I'm going to say thank you so much, Natasha, Linda, and Sarah, and to everyone who
wonderful.
joined this. It really has.